In 1543, a Chinese ship with 3 Portuguese sailors on board was headed to Macau, but was swept off course and ended up on the Japanese island of Tanegashima. Antonio da Mota, Francisco Zimoto and Antonio Pesciato, the first Europeans to ever step on Japanese soil, were deemed southern barbarians by the locals because of the direction from which they came and their unusual, non-Japanese features. The Japanese were in the middle of a civil war and eventually began trading with the Portuguese, in general, for guns. And thus began a Portuguese trading post in Japan, starting with firearms and then other items such as soap, tobacco, wool and even recipes. The Portuguese remained in Japan until 1639, when they were banished because the ruling shogun Iemitsu believed Christianity was a threat to Japanese society. As the ships sailed away for the final time, the Portuguese left an indelible mark on the island, a battered and fried green bean recipe called piquinhos da horta. Today, in Japan, it's called tempura and has been a staple of the country's cuisine ever since. You may also be interested in the hearty stew that unites a nation. The bread baked by bubbling geese is the planet's most overrated sandwich. No one knows the exact origins of piquinhos da horta. We know it existed in 1543, said Michelin-starred chef José Avils when I met up with him at Cantinho de Avils, one of his acclaimed Lisbon restaurants. But before that, it's anyone's guess. Green beans, it turns out, changed food history. However, piquinhos da horta was only one of many dishes the Portuguese inspired around the world. In fact, Portuguese cuisine, still heavily overshadowed by the cuisines of Italy, Spain and France, may be the most influential cuisine on the planet. Portuguese cuisine may be the most influential cuisine on the planet. When the Portuguese turned up in Goa, India, where they stayed until 1961, they cooked a galoki, wine-spiked pork dish called carne de vinho dallos, which was adopted by locals to become vindaloo, one of the most popular Indian dishes today. In Malaysia, several staples, including the spicy stew bal, hail from Portuguese traders of centuries past. Egg tarts in Macau and southern China are direct descendants to the egg tarts found in Lisbon bakeries. And Brazil's national dish, feijoada, a stew with beans and pork, has its origins in the northern Portuguese region of Minho. Today, you can find variations of it everywhere the Portuguese have sailed, including Goa, Mozambique, Angola, Macau and Cape Verde. Piquinhos da horta were often eaten during Lent or Ember days. The word tempura comes from the Latin word tempora, a term referring to these times of fasting, when the Church dictated that Catholics go meatless. So the way around that, Avils said, was to batter and fry a vegetable, like the green bean. And just to add to it, we called it piquinhos da horta, little fish of the garden. If you can't eat meat for that period of time, this was a good replacement. The word tempura comes from the Latin word tempora and it had other functions too. When the pork didn't afford fish, they would eat these fried green beans as a substitute, Avil said. And sailors would fry the beans to preserve them during long journeys, much in the way humans have been curing and salting meat for preservation purposes for centuries. Perhaps not constricted by tradition, the Japanese lightened the batter and changed up the fillings. Today, everything from shrimp to sweet potatoes to shiitake mushrooms is turned into tempura. The Japanese inherited the dish from us and they made it better, Avil said. Avil said Japanese people sometimes turn up at his restaurants and see the fried bean dish and say, "Hey, Portuguese cuisine is influenced by Japanese cuisine." He added, "And that's when I say, no, in this case it's the other way around." A Japanese-born sous chef at Avil's Michelin-starred Lisbon restaurant, Bel Canto, even chose to train in Portugal instead of France because he recognized the influence on his home cuisine, particularly in piquinhos da horta. Avil said his one complaint about the dish, in general, has always been that the beans are often fried in the morning and so they go cold and limp by the time they get to the table later that day. He remedies this by not only cooking them on demand, but by adding a starch called nutrios that keeps them crispy. After the bean is blanched, it gets rolled in the batter of wheat flour, egg, milk, and nutrios and then flash fried. Other chefs I talked to in Portugal had their own recipes for the fried green beans, but they didn't deviate much. "It's a very simple dish," said Chef Olivier da Costa, when I met up with him at his Lisbon restaurant Olivier Avenida, located in the Avenida Liberdade Hotel. "I use a batter of flour, milk, eggs, salt, pepper and beer," he said. Beer, I asked. Yes, it ferments the batter and the beer foam gives it a better taste. He didn't have the dish on his menu at the time, so I had to take his word for it. One reason why Portuguese love Piscinhos da Horta so much, Da Costa said, was nostalgia. We all eat it as children and thus have fond memories of it. These days it's been making a comeback, not just because people are eating more vegetarian food, but because a younger generation are taking more interest in our local cuisine and because they want to be taken back to that simpler time. Avils is taking this newfound interest in super traditional Portuguese cuisine to a new level. Along with his Japanese-born sous chef, he plans to temporarily offer a tasting menu called 1543, the year the Portuguese first showed up in Japan, offering Piscinhos da Horta and other Portuguese dishes that have inspired Japanese cuisine. Alongside the Portuguese dishes, he plans to serve the Japanese versions that evolved from the Portuguese presence in Japan 4.5 centuries ago. Each bite was like taking a first bite back at Cantinho de Avils. An order of Piscinhos da Horta appeared in front of me. They were rigid like pencils with a lumpy texture and a yellowish hue. Each bite was like taking a first bite, crisp, light and super flavorful, the crunchy texture of the batter complementing the sturdy feel of the bean. The dish has been one of the only consistent items on the menu at Cantinho de Avils, which opened in 2012. I can't take it off, Avils said. My regulars would be enraged. Join over 3 million BBC travel fans by liking us on Facebook, or follow us on Twitter and Instagram. If you liked this story, sign up for the weekly BBC.com features newsletter called If You Only Read 6 Things This Week. A hand-picked selection of stories from BBC Future, Earth, Culture, Capital and Travel, delivered to your inbox every Friday.